Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Tanya Kinchelo. As a board vice president of Trusted Mentors, I want to thank you for taking the time to join us for Trusted Mentors Lunch and Learn Speaker Series 2022. We hope you enjoy learning no matter where you are lunching today. If you are inspired during today's presentation by the stories you hear about the power of mentoring and the work our volunteer mentors do and the success our mentees achieve, I ask you to tell someone about Trusted Mentors. Post it on your social media pages, tell family and friends. Help us get the word out about our programs. Just a housekeeping item. All participants will be muted with camera off during today's presentation. All questions can be entered into the chat room. Trusted Mentors seeks to provide a welcoming and inclusive environment free from all forms of discrimination, harassment, and retaliation. We are committed to an atmosphere that encourages free expression and the exchange of ideas. Trusted Mentor reserves the right to remove any participant whose comments are deemed discriminatory or inappropriate. Again, I'm Tanya Kinchelo, Indianapolis, Indiana real estate broker. I know in real terms the value of having your own home. I am also an experienced mentor and understand the challenges people face to stay housed. For over 15 years, Trusted Mentors has trained and deployed hundreds of mentors who have built powerful relationships with at-risk adults in the process of helping those individuals stay housed, out of jail, and living stable lives. Whether someone has recently been homeless, is a youth transitioning to adulthood, or formerly incarcerated individual attempting to reintegrate into society, acknowledging inequity that they face and work to rectify it is something that Trusted Mentors has done masterfully. We understand that simply getting employment or a place to live or reuniting with estranged family members isn't equity. Those are steps in the right direction, but there are additional steps needed to move to a more equitable place. Mentors can assist in moving a person forward by providing additional knowledge needed to achieve greater equity. We also realize that recent events have made the inequities of racism more visible. There is a growing need to better understand the reality of racism and its effects upon individuals. The experience of repeated racism throughout the life and generations before leads to what is known as racial trauma. This year at our Lunch and Learn series, Trusted Mentor desires to unpack experience of racial trauma and how it affects individuals and the systems we live within. Jacqueline Bell, known more often as JB, will lead us into this important topic. JB is a retired adjunct professor from Indiana University School of Social Work, IUSSW. After 13 years, she's worked part-time as an outreach consultant for Brooks Place for grieving young people and has associated with Brooks Place for 11 years. She has been an independent consultant trainer since 1999. Last, she is a volunteer mentor and trainer for Trusted Mentors for the last 8 years. Past employment includes 15 years experience with Marriott International as a hotel general manager, certified trainer, and human resource executive, and 6 years experience with Missouri state government. She holds a BS and an MSW in social work from Tuskegee University, Alabama, and Washington University, Missouri, respectfully. She was featured in Black Enterprise February 2000, Making Sense of Money Matters, Take Financial Control of Your Enterprise. We welcome JB to begin unpacking racial trauma.
Good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us, and thank you, Trusted Mentors, for having me. What I like to do right now is, in fact, connect you, share my screen with you, and we shall begin unpacking racism. Hopefully everyone can in fact see. Let me know, Carolyn, if one cannot. What I would like to do today is define racism and its workings in society.
JB, excuse us, we're still seeing you.
You're still seeing me, okay. Hold on a minute. How are we now?
We're good now.
We are good. Okay. Okay, I'm just going to move through it. So today what I'd like to do is define racism and its working in society, provide a historical foundation for understanding racism, describe the emotional, physical, and social effects of racism, which is in fact social trauma, racial trauma, define racial trauma, and identify steps to address racism and racial trauma. Hold on 1 minute here. All right. I have to get my computer set up here. Okay. The discussion of race and racial trauma is never easy. I am thankful today to the millions of people who carry cameras. Because of their cell phones, the world would not have seen the treatment of Floyd and his tragic death. And millions would still be saying there is no racism. So let us begin with some points to consider. Okay. First of all, the United Nations World Conference in 2001 declared the United States slavery as crimes against humanity. Wouldn't you know that the United States delegates walked out? They have defined the crimes against humanity as it relates to slavery as no other slavery that has ever existed. Okay. There were at least 10 to 15 million Africans captured, and they really do not have an accurate count. And they were crammed into cargo ships. Millions died, committed suicide, or they became enslaved once they got to the United States. You have to understand the conditions these Africans were brought over in. They were restrained in the bowels of ships where they were forced to sleep, weep, eat, defecate, urinate, menstruate, vomit, give birth to, and die. They had no rights. They were only seen as property, and they had no way of gaining their freedom. And the effects of trauma experienced by Africans were never addressed after the Emancipation Proclamation. Other points to consider. The history of chattel slavery in the United States has been sanitized with respect to the genocide of Native Americans and the enslavement and later oppression of those African descent. What do I mean? What I mean is that we don't know the history. It has been written by individuals who did not want to tell it exactly as it was, but wanted to tell it in a more humane way. Because of the sanitation, it makes it very difficult for whites to acknowledge and confront racism, and difficult for non-white people of color to recover economically, socially, and psychologically from racism, resulting in generational racial trauma. If you truly want to get a clear understanding of the experience of persons with African descent and what the Africans went through, I suggest that you go to the museum, and I call it the Lynching Museum, which is in Montgomery, Alabama. This narrative museum uses interactive media, sculpture, videography, and exhibits to immerse visitors in the sights and sounds of what the slave trade was, Jim Crow laws of the South, and how the world's largest prison system was created. Even to date, I am still traumatized by what I saw because it was so authentic. Other points I would like for you to consider today. Okay, Irrespective of race, we all have been racially socialized in the United States. The difference is our position in society. In other words, have we received messages that are positive, saying that our hair and skin is beautiful, deserving of that promotion that we are best qualified for? Do we have access to low interest loans? Are we smart? Or have we received negative messages, such as you're lazy, you're loud, you're defiant, that dark skin is not acceptable, you have kinky hair, which is worth it, etc. You get the impression, okay? Some, perhaps many of my comments may make you feel uncomfortable. I am asking you to sit with it, stay engaged, and try to determine the source of the discomfort. It is never easy to talk about race. Why do you think it was excluded from the history books? Okay. I would also like for you to stop looking at exceptions and see the population in groups being terrorized by racial discrimination or injustice. I can't tell you how many times persons have said to me, well, JB, you made it. Yes, but I feel myself as an exception. How can one be released from slavery, no clothes, no money, no housing, no land, and expect not to be impacted by it, not to expect a large group to be impacted, okay? Other things, I will use the terms racial trauma, trauma based on race-related stress, and race-based traumatic stress interchangeably. And last but not least, please do not be offended because there are some profane words in my presentation. I will try at all times to be profound, but please do not be offended because the profanity helps demonstrate the severity of what we're talking about. So let's get on the same page by defining racism and racial trauma. Okay. Dr. Joy DeGruy, in her book, Post-Traumatic Slave Syndrome, I believe gives a great definition of racism. Racism is the belief that people differ along biological and genetic lines, and that one's own group is superior, and that happens to be white, and it's superior to another group, and that's a group of non-white individuals. This belief is coupled with the power to negatively affect the lives of those perceived to be inferior. And it was this distinction of superiority and inferiority that in fact helps create racial trauma. So what is racial trauma or race-related stress? Racial trauma or race-based trauma may result from racial harassment, racial discrimination, witnessing racial violence, or experiencing institutional racism. Furthermore, racial trauma or race-based traumatic stress refers to the mental and emotional injury. And I want to stress the term injury caused by encounters with racial bias, ethnic discrimination, racism, and hate crimes. So why are we discussing it? Several reasons why we need to have the conversation about racial trauma. Research has shown individuals and an individual or individuals have experienced emotionally painful, sudden, uncontrollable racial encounters are at risk of suffering from a race-based traumatic stress injury, damage to the individual. What else does research show? In the United States, Black, Indigenous people of color, who are now referred to as BIPOC, are most vulnerable due to living under a system of white supremacy, again, impacting one's mental and physical state. Race-based discrimination, bias can also have detrimental psychological impacts on individuals and their wider communities. And I'm going to give you shortly some examples of those. Okay. Why else are we discussing it? Because individuals that have prolonged incidents of racism can actually start to portray symptoms of persons that have post-traumatic stress disorder. And we're going to define what that is. Most of you probably are aware of. Other reasons for discussing it. Today, 96% of Black Americans report daily experiences of racism and discrimination, and they admit that it affects their mental health, especially it impacts males, and the rate of depression has quadrupled in the last 2 decades for African American males. Okay. It is found, research has found now that suicide is the 3rd leading cause of death for Black males between the age of 15 to 24. 3rd leading. Number 1 would be homicide, which stems from racism and self-hatred, which we shall talk about later. Okay. High earning Black women have the same risk for low birth rate babies as low earning white women. Okay. The Center for the Study of Hate and Extremism has found that hate crimes, physical or verbal assaults, are at their highest in a decade, with African Americans being the targeted group, regardless of their economic status. Okay. Other reasons: Native American women or indigenous women are murdered at a rate of 10% higher than the national average. Okay. I hope that you are seeing the pattern of how racism is impacting communities of color and why it's so important to address the racial trauma, which is impacting persons physically and also emotionally and mentally. Homicide is the leading cause of death for young indigenous women. Roughly 30% of Native Americans currently live on tribal lands or reservations. However, it is referred to not as a 3rd world country, but they are referred to as 4th world countries because of the deplorable, horrible living conditions. 71% of children in poverty are of color. It is estimated currently that 10.5 million children in the United States live in poverty. It breaks down to 1 in every 4 Blacks or African Americans is in poverty. 1 in every 5 Hispanic or Native American live in poverty, and 1 in 12. The disparities are there. And 1 in 12 whites. Okay. And in 2018, 38% of the Latinx people were verbally attacked for speaking Spanish, or they were told to go back to their own country. Let me give you some other reasons why we're still discussing. Okay. 33% of the prison population, Black people, and they are only 12% of the country's population. Okay. Previous or current policies of racial displacement, exclusion, and segregation have left people of color, likely than whites, not to own their own homes, regardless of their education, income, location, marital status, or age. Rates of suicide are 3.5 times higher in Native American communities than any other racial group. And the one with which most of us are familiar because we've seen it in the news media: how do communities of color relate to the police? Okay. In a study in the African American Journal of Public Health, they looked at the impact of police shootings on African Americans. What they found: 85% of the participants in the study reported being stopped by law enforcement at least one time in their life. 78% had no history of criminal activity. And those who reported more intrusive police contact experienced increased trauma and anxiety symptoms after the encounter. And those who reported fair treatment during the encounter had fewer symptoms of post-traumatic stress syndrome and anxiety. Okay. As we go through this presentation, I want you to consider the following slide. Trusted Mentors uses this slide in their training of their mentors. And I decided it is such a good slide as far as explaining why it is sometimes so difficult for individuals to talk about race. And as you see in this slide, it shows someone on an island. And what this person sees is the boat. while the other person is in the boat and what they see is the land. What we have here is different frames of reference. I mentioned before the position of individuals in society. And as it said here, societal position of whites and people of color cannot agree on racial matters because they perceive racism very differently. And let me go back. We have been socialized, our experiences, how we've been trained, our cultures to, and that is why we see racism very differently. Other points I'd like you to consider and remember, and I think this next statement, it sums it up very well. Okay, James Lowen, who is a sociologist, in his book, Lies My Teacher Told Me, Everything Your American History Textbook Got Wrong, it talks about the racial history in the United States, which has been routinely minimized, distorted, or excluded in the United States miseducation. Again, another reason for the different viewpoints by individuals in society, those privileged versus those unprivileged. And I also love this comment by Crystal Fleming. Crystal Fleming states in her book, How to Be Less Stupid About Race, we are systematically exposed to racial stupidity and racial beliefs that warp our understandings of society, history, and ourselves. Living in a racist society socializes us to be stupid about race, thus ignoring the racial trauma faced by millions of people of color. Let's look at some historical facts and how racism is still perpetuated today. Let me applaud the society for at least now taking the initiative to finally start to have conversations around race, discrimination, and also around social justice and mental health. Let me do this comparison for you. Okay. What we have on the left-hand side is slavery and how it was institutionalized. In other words, there were laws set in place by whites to, in fact, make it an institution and keep individuals enslaved. Versus what is present-day racial discrimination? And what I want you to understand is how it connects from slavery to present day. Even though the chains may have been removed, however, the scars and brutality and inhumaneness has been created and passed on multi-generationally, and therefore we have trauma. Let's do the comparison, okay? In slavery, we had the white male decision makers. I would say today, we still have white male decision makers, and the majority are, even though with the new protests or the protests that occurred last year, and I say new because there have been protests against racial discrimination for years, at least 400, okay? Second, in slavery, Africans were dehumanized. They were not considered human beings at all. They were just considered property. Today, in many instances, okay, we are conceived and perceived as being invisible and still devalued. Our opinions are devalued when we express many times how we feel, okay? In slavery, African Americans or Africans at that time were involuntary, they were forced labor, hiring practices. Today, many people that may have an African American name or a Native name may not be hired. In slavery, there was no income. Today, there's limited access to capital, or persons may be hired into the lowest paying jobs. Okay. Even though COVID has brought some attention to the low paying jobs, and now employers in many instances are forced to pay more. Lest I regress, okay? In slavery, it was against the law to educate. Today, we still have inferior educational systems. In slavery, no one was allowed to own land, okay? They lived in shacks, they were cold, and today we still have the practice of redlining where only persons can move into certain areas, and it may not be the best neighborhoods, may have inferior housing. Other comparisons, In slavery, they were living and working in conditions that resulted in poor health and disease, very little, if any, healthcare. Today, there's still limited access. Even though things are improvement, there are still health disparities. In slavery, if one was not submissive, they were beaten, raped, lynched, and then once they had the Emancipation Proclamation, they still had what they call the convict lease system, because individuals were released with no money, no land, no place to go. So therefore, they created laws where persons had to stay on the plantation and work. And they had to work their way. Some were called sharecroppers. And history shows they were never able to work their way off, quote unquote, the plantation. Today, we have that overrepresentation of Blacks and people of color in the criminal justice system. They had no legal rights in slavery. There is today a denial of legal and human rights. For example, voting. In the South, they're trying to redistrict and stop people from voting, if you've been paying any attention to the news. And the last, slavery resulted in unearned wealth, which is profitable for whites, and unearned property. So let's look at racism. Again, we already have the definition. It is the belief that people differ along biological lines and genetic lines. Okay, one other point I want to make, it was used to justify what we call the general realizability of dominant racial group values. In other words, it was set as a standard by which to judge other people, okay? And what has research shown? It has shown that race has no significant merit. There are no significant genetic variations within the human species. Okay? Racial trauma. I've already given you a definition of that. Okay? But what I'd like to do is share this one that was given, or that I got from the Behavioral Wellness Clinic. I think it is so accurate. Racial trauma or race-related stress is the way people experience racism daily, and that's important, daily. They may not experience an event every day, but so often that is impactful. Having to think about your appearance, being judged as a criminal, being afraid to jog in your own neighborhood, being questioned or assumed to be a service worker versus someone who is a professional, even though you may have on a business suit, okay? Having police encounters, which are life and death situations. And lastly, racism can be stressful and even traumatic. It takes very real emotional and psychological toll. What is interesting is that the Behavioral Wellness Clinic has also come up with this racial trauma scale, which I thought would be interesting. And it says, think about all the times when you have heard about, seen, or experienced racial discrimination. As a result of this, how bothered have you been by the following? And we are going to use this in our workshop to see how impacted individuals were. Interesting enough, I did take it online, and yes, I have been racially traumatized. Let me say this. How does racial trauma differ from the other types of stress? Okay, first of all, it starts at birth and it continues through life because of one's color. Next, there are systems that are constantly working that in fact create stress. The educational system, the healthcare system, the political system, the housing system, okay? Continuous, ambiguous nature of microaggressions, which we're going to talk about here in a minute. These always send messages, and they're not intentional, but oftentimes they minimize the experiences of people of color, okay? It is chronic and ongoing, and it can be exhausting. It just can be exhausting, okay? And over time, the individual coping techniques are exhausted, which lead to negative health outcomes, and it is caused exclusively by race-related stressors. Let me talk about now vicarious racism, which definitely leads to racial trauma. So what is it? It's experiencing racial discrimination indirectly. It's hearing about it or witnessing it through close contacts such as family members, friends, and peers. Furthermore, it is experienced by those who are not directly involved with the event, but who can identify with the victims of racism based on a number of factors: age, gender, community, i.e. George Floyd, Mr. Brown in Ferguson, who in fact was killed. There was another Black man that was killed by police. Furthermore, vicarious racism, which leads to racial trauma, many times because we are bombarded by images on social media in our community, or when incidents are reported in the news, when public figures make racial statements, or when talked about on social media. Any exposure to the existence of racist views, discrimination, or hate crimes. This is vicarious racism. What are some of the examples? You're well aware of them, but probably haven't thought about it. Viewing videos of brutal police killings, and I've already mentioned George Floyd. Okay, having a friend who has committed suicide, knowing multiple persons who have been killed through gun violence, being aware that of the Latinx youth that immigrate to the United States. Did you know 2/3 report witnessing a violent event or actually being physically assaulted or witnessing a physical assault? Other ways, vicariously, we can experience racial trauma. It's talked about, it's what we call being transmitted through the whole knowledge of chattel enslavement of Africans in the United States. It's a source of traumatic stress for people today. I have to admit, in preparing this presentation, I actually had some flashbacks of some of my experiences. Reading about my people was traumatic. Thinking about the museum to which I went in Montgomery, Alabama, that identifies at least 400 individuals that were lynched. Okay. Again, vicarious racism causes racial trauma through sustained what they call collective trauma, makes Black people highly vulnerable to believing mental health disorders, okay, that develop in mental health disorders, excuse me, okay. Also, historically, I don't think there's any other group besides Native Americans that have been more discriminated against. And a good example when we talk about the Native Americans and how it's historically transmitted, if you look at the boarding schools, the massacres, the forced and violent removal from their tribal lands, it represents a severe communal loss and source of traumatic stress because they are now living, they now know what happened in the past. Native Americans today continue to experience symptoms of depression, substance dependence, diabetes, and unemployment due to the psychological impact of trauma. What I would like to do is take a minute here. I keep looking at the clock because I'm looking at the time of racial trauma and show you how it can develop. Research has indicated that children as well as adults can experience and be impacted by racial-based traumatic stress and racial trauma. I want you to just look at this video and see how it can be perpetrated at a very young age.
Hi, Mom, it's me. I got in trouble again at school today.
Hi, this is Miss Jones again. I'm finding your son very disruptive in class, more so than other students.
I feel like the teacher doesn't like me. Other kids do bad things, but they don't get in trouble.
He's defiant and shows a real lack of respect for any structure or authority.
I hate school because the teachers are always mean to me and I don't feel like I'm learning anything.
I'm really concerned about his behavior.
I'm always getting in trouble for what I didn't do.
We're going to have to adopt a zero tolerance policy, young man.
School keeps calling my mother and she gets really, really mad at me.
What is going on? You better
I
explain.
feel like the whole world is just turned up against me. It doesn't like me anymore. There are days I get up and I just decide I'm not going to school.
And we go to the park. Like, everybody's always telling me I'm not worth anything, so what's the point of trying?
I know the cops are watching us, but we just hope we don't get caught.
If your son's absences are a problem, they will definitely affect his grade point average.
I don't feel safe in my class anymore.
Should I assume you're unprepared again today?
I would always eventually get picked on by the teacher. He makes examples of me.
I feel really singled out, and I just try to avoid people because every time I look, somebody's always talking about me. Oh, she's always getting in trouble.
But I started fighting more because nobody wants to hang out around the troublemaker. The only time I have real friends is when I'm on the block. So that's why I stayed.
I'm sure you understand we take our discipline policies very seriously here at the school. What are we going to do about your son?
And so the cycle begins. If you will notice, I'm just going to point out some of the biases and stereotypical terms that are used as relates to Black children. And as you saw at the end, they are expelled at a higher rate than their white counterparts. It begins with the labeling of being disruptive, defiant. We're going to have zero tolerance. Then the person starts to internalize. They'll say, I'm always picked on, and I'm always singled out. I do not feel safe in the classroom. And that's really important. When individuals do not feel safe, they don't want to participate. And the next thing you know, this individual is skipping school. All of the research shows that education helps persons advance. So now they've dropped out of school, and it is a cycle, and we have to break that cycle. I would be remiss if I would not discuss the whole issue of internalized racism. And one of the things that the little boy said, well, actually, he was a teenager at the time, is that I don't feel like I have any worth. Why should I try? And that is what we call internalized racism, based on how the individual is being treated. The little boy wasn't doing anything. He was just active. He was tapping his pencil. Next thing you know, that turns into an individual who may be incarcerated later down the road because they don't feel valued by society. So what is internalized racism? It is belief about one's own inferiority, weaknesses, shortcomings as a function of a member in an oppressed group. Okay, it could be hatred for self, which is due to socialization and a racist system of oppression. And I've already talked about the legacy of trauma that is exhibited in many of the behaviors and beliefs that were adopted by our ancestors in order to survive in slavery. Okay? Because we are not aware in many instances of the internalized racism or how we feel about each other because of the legacy of trauma, we also begin to act out and hurt those nearest us. Many of us may also be suffering from, and again, we don't know how to identify it, but it's what is called the survivor syndrome. This is survivor's guilt when a person has feelings that they have survived a threatening situation when others did not. And in many instances, if we think about slavery and how the slaves had to deny themselves their name, their culture, had to adopt behaviors that would make them survive in slavery. And they may have passed this down. And it's shown it is passed down. A common reaction to traumatic events, and it is a symptom of post-traumatic stress disorder. So that is internalized racism. What I would like to do now is talk about microaggressions. Okay, what are they? Microaggressions are very commonplace. It could be verbal, behavioral, or environmental indignities, whether intentional or unintentional, that communicate hostile, derogatory, or negative racial slights and insults to people of color. Okay, according to Kevin Nadell, microaggressions are defined as the everyday, subtle, intentional, and sometimes unintentional interactions or behaviors that communicate some sort of bias toward historically marginalized or oppressed or persons classified as inferior groups. I do like Dr. Stephen Nifley's identification of 3 types of microaggression. First, we have micro insults. These are communications that convey rudeness and insensitivity and demean a person's racial heritage, such as descriptions about skin or hair being thick and not straight, or skin color. Micro assault. It is a very explicit racial derogatory characterization, and it primarily could be a violent, verbal, nonverbal, or environmental attack, which is really meant to harm the individual at whom it is directed. And then microinvalidation, which could be communications that exclude, neglect, or nullify the psychological thoughts, feelings, or lived experience of people of color. Because I have taught class, I have heard people of color state heartfeltly what they had experienced based on race. And I've heard white students attempt to deny that doesn't really happen, which in effect is calling that individual a lie. And I will not tolerate that and have not tolerated that in my classroom. I'd like to show you this next video, which really sums up microaggressions.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem,
oh, you're so well spoken.
Just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
It's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while.
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland.
Sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date.
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
Going grocery shopping.
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
Commuting to work.
So when are you going to have a baby?
Watching TV.
We have to keep the Redskins name part of our culture and history.
Or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? He's shopping advice.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try this challenging major.
Ow, what a dream.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
It looked like you was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
And by mosquito bites, we mean microaggressions.
I think that speaks for itself. And I've already mentioned about post-traumatic stress disorder and how all these microaggressions, active racial discrimination, witnessing, whether you're experiencing it, witnessing it with peers, your family members, or your friends, it can lead to PTSD. And here are some of, as it relates to the DSM, which is a medical book, some of you may be familiar with it, that gives you characteristics that could determine whether or not an individual has post-traumatic stress syndrome. And just let me say right here, in case I haven't said it, everyone does not have PTSD or a racial traumatic stress disorder. even though they experience racial discrimination. It really depends on one's experiences and also their coping skills. So here are some PTSD, and I will not talk about all of them. Serious threat or harm to one's life or one's children, destruction of home or community, seeing another person injured or killed, stress experience with intense fear, terror, helplessness, a stress disorder considered to be more serious and will last longer when stressors are of human design. PTSD, post-traumatic stress syndrome, okay? Other symptoms, what they may have, okay? Flashback and nightmares, depression, intrusive thoughts, restrictive emotional expression, inability to concentrate, hyperactivity, low self-esteem, high arousal. So how do we cope with all these microaggressions? Okay, I'm gonna put them all up here. Okay. This is an example from Ella Washington and et al. And it talks about when and how to respond to microaggressions. First of all, discern. Determine how much of an interest you want to make in addressing the microaggression. You have to disarm the individual and explain the conversation might be uncomfortable because what they said was uncomfortable to you. It says defy. Challenge the person to clarify their statement or their action so that there, in fact, is a clear understanding. You're not trying to change your mind. You just want them to clarify. And then the last thing you should do is decide, how are you going to deal with this incident? In other words, you control what this incident will mean for your life and your work. What will you take from the interaction and what you will allow to take from you? It's up to you. It's truly up to you. Okay? Other ways of coping with racial trauma. We talk about affirmation and acknowledgement with professionals. We talk about professionals helping the individual to develop a sense of understanding and acceptance of racial issues. And it doesn't have to be a professional. It can be anyone that is concerned about eliminating racial trauma and racial discrimination. The point is to have a dialogue. Second, create a space for persons to feel safe and they can dialogue. As Hardy says, we must take a proactive role to identify race as a significant variable and talk about it. Other ways of coping with racial trauma. Storytelling. I can remember hearing about racial incidents when I was coming up from my great uncles. Okay, it helps individuals share their experiences. Okay, then the next I would say, what to do, validate. Once you hear about individuals' personal, their qualities, their stories, their experiences, validate it. Don't devalue them, value them as being true. The process of naming. Allowing individuals to name these experiences will give them a voice to speak on. It also recognizes how persons have been impacted by these experiences. Okay. Externalized devaluation. It says, have people focus on increasing respect and recognizing that racial events do not lower their self-esteem. In other words, they're not responsible in most cases for the racism that they in fact are experiencing. Number 7, it says use a combination of psychological, emotional, and behavioral resources to build self-esteem and counter racial attacks. Prevent future loss of dignity and sense of self. We're not saying that you have to know everything. It's good to educate yourself and have resources to which you can refer an individual, especially if you know that they are dealing with racial trauma. Okay. Re-challenging rage. Okay, individuals learn to gain control of their emotions and not let emotions consume them. Much of the research shows that individuals of color are really angry about what in fact has happened to them, and many times do not know in fact how to express it. But if individuals learn to control their emotions and not let their emotions consume them, people become empowered. They keep pushing forward through adversity and they increase their coping skills. What can you do as an individual? Okay. In short, show support. Individual support for racial trauma and racial stress. Let individuals know they are not alone. First of all, see them as their authentic selves. Don't try to change the individual. Meet them where they are. Okay, and I'm only asking you to do as much as you are comfortable with. All of us are not as astute and not as comfortable. Okay, remind individuals of their slave history before they were slaves. Okay, yes, you may have been a slave, but you also had a history. You also did thrive. You came from a culture where it was rich. Remind them of that if you can. Encourage them to conquer the enemy within. In effect, I'm talking about internalized racism. And the last thing is practice cultural humility. What is that? Well, according to the National Institute of Health, cultural humility is a lifelong process. Let me say it again. It is a lifelong process of self-reflection and self-critique, whereby the individual not only learns about another person's culture, but they start to examine their own beliefs and cultural identity. Okay. According to the Hogg Foundation, we move between several different cultures, often without even thinking about it. So we have to understand our own culture, our own life experiences, so that we can put in context the other person's life experiences. And we have to reflect on our own background and our firsthand situations. Next, cultural humility is distinct from cultural competence. Cultural competence means that we learn about another person's culture. Reflection means that we explore our own beliefs in order to be more aware of potential judgments that we have about others. Okay. Cultural humility requires historical awareness. In order to practice true cultural humility, persons must also be aware of and sensitive to the historic realities like legacies of violence and oppression against certain groups of people, people of color, thus causing a history of mistrust. So what would I like for you to take away from here? In conclusion, I would like for you to accept the fact that slavery didn't end. It evolved. Okay, be racially aware. In other words, understand that the concept of race truly exists and that it shapes the reality of many people, some in equitable ways and just ways, and inequitable ways and unjust ways for other individuals. Some type of movement for social justice has been going on for years and years and years. Thank goodness for cell phones and the posts that people make on social media, which has made individuals aware who have never experienced racial trauma or racism in their lives. Now, because it is caught on video and posted, many persons are starting to believe that there is, in fact, racial discrimination, thus causing racial trauma. All the research that I have read shows that Blacks and Native American have the worst results in looking at factors that contribute to well-being, jobs, careers, housing, poverty, education, homelessness, etc. Remember that how people of color may respond to you may not necessarily be about you, but the effects of numerous microaggressions, several cases of racial discrimination or racial bias, racial judgment. Respond with empathy. What I'd like for you to do, which is posted on the screen, is make a contract with yourself. It's very simple. It says contract with yourself to live and practice in a culturally humble manner. As a result of this training today, I'd like you to think about what would you like to do? How would you like to move forward? Write a contract with yourself on how you will respond and refer to it often. Once you write that contract, refer to it. Become an ally. Educate yourself on racial issues. Last, remember what every human being desires in life, and that is elimination from discrimination, racial bias, and unbiased just treatment. What we are looking for in life, I think this next slide sums it up. That is what would cause less suffering and allow individuals to thrive. And that is, according to Tom Rath and Jim Harder, when we talk about well-being, it is having a career, having a social life with strong relationships, being financially stable and able to manage that, being in good health, having the energy to get things done, and last, have a sense of engagement in a community where you can thrive. As I conclude, I'd also like to say I am very hopeful because a survey from Pew shows as of March 2021, a majority of Americans do in fact see discrimination against Black, Latinx, and Asian people in the United States. For me, this is progress. And remember, racial trauma and racism can be addressed and eliminated. Thank you for your time and attention. And are there any questions?
Wow, JB, thank you so much for that informative and compassionate presentation. This topic is never easy, but I think when we know better, we do better. And what I mean by know better is understanding racial trauma. So I have now added that Montgomery Museum to my bucket list. So thank you for that. So now we'll take.
I was going to say, truly be prepared because you will experience vicarious trauma. I could only stay in there 20 minutes and it's a huge, huge museum. In fact, it's in two buildings. It was so real. Wow. It was so real, I was transported back to slavery. You could hear the cries of the mothers as children were being taken from them. It was very well done. That's all I can say. But be prepared for the emotional trauma that you may experience.
Okay, thank you. So we have some questions in the chat. We have reached our time limit, but everyone's welcome to stay. One of the questions that we have is, can you share a personal personal experience of racism that you have experienced either as a child, as an adult, or even in your professional life?
Okay, I think I would utilize the example of one when I was a child. I can remember my great uncles, my grandfathers, brothers, telling me the stories of how they had to leave Mississippi because as Black men, they were not going to tolerate how they were being disrespected by white folks. Because at that time it was Jim Crow laws, and they decided they had to leave. They were going to be hung because they were just too outspoken. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you, JB, again. I just want to tell everybody thank you as well for joining us. We want to extend our sincere thanks to JB for starting us on the road to unpacking racial trauma. And if you're like me and wanting more, Trusted Mentors is offering an in-person workshop, Unpacking Racial Trauma, on Saturday, March the 26th from 9 to noon. That's Saturday.
Okay. Tanya, what I wanted to say.
March the 26th from 9 to noon. Please keep looking for more informative presentations. Oh, go ahead.
And Tanya, what I wanted to say In the workshop, it will be extremely interactive. Just because we were on Zoom today is why I did not, what they say, call and response. What I love to have the interaction, because I do believe it is in participation that we truly learn. So let me encourage people to come to the workshop.
All right. Okay. Thanks for that. So the workshop will be on Saturday the 26th, Saturday the 26th from 9 to noon. Please keep looking, be on the lookout for some of our other presentations throughout the year. Next month, we have a presentation in April. If you were inspired during this Lunch and Learn, join the work of our volunteers, or want to find out what our mentees have achieved, I ask that you tell someone you know about Trusted Mentors. Post this on your social media sites, tell your coworkers, your family, and friends. Help us get the word out. Plus, save the day for our Fresh Start Restart bike run event on Saturday, June the 4th. That's Saturday, June the 4th, our Fresh Start Restart. Whether you're walking, running, jogging, or biking, we want you to have a fresh start in this fun peer-to-peer fundraising event. Thanks again, everyone, and we will send out a recording of this event to all those who have registered. Enjoy your day, and we look forward to seeing you again. Bye.